Welcome back. Today I want to talk about a grain's journey to whiskey. Kind of give you an overview of the process, and so you can see how many people are involved and the parts and pieces that go into getting the whiskey that you're enjoying in your hand. It starts with the backbone of America, the farmers. They are growing these grains, and it does have to be a grain. No fruits, potatoes can be whiskey. The grains that they're growing are most commonly the corn, rye, wheat, and barley. Now, another cool thing is that a lot of these craft distillers are working with local farmers to source local grains. They're also working with farmers to grow rare varietals of grains to see what and how that impacts the flavor of the whiskey. So farmers are a big part of the grain's journey and part of whiskey. Without farmers, we wouldn't have the grains to make the whiskey. So it starts with the farmers growing and harvesting those grains. Now, depending on the type of grain and distillery, the next step may vary. Sometimes, in the case of barley, especially for Scotch, they are sent to a malting house. Sometimes the distilleries have them on site, other times they do not. What this does is this goes through the process called malting, where they take the grains, steep them in water for a few days, then drain and let them germinate. What this does is this exposes the starches in the grain. So at the height of this conversion, whenever it has all the grains are maximized in the amount of starch exposed, they cut that process off with heat. They don't roast them, but what they do is they blow hot air from underneath and around the grains to dry them. This is where you'll get peat and smoke introduced to the whiskey, because that'll be the fuel source that is creating the heat and then coming up and around and imparting those flavors onto the grains that are now called malt. So this is where you get your single malt. It's barley, but it's gone through the malting process. So all grains can be malted. Barley just happens to be the most common one done. So then the next step is the distillery will mill or mash the grains into a flour-like consistency called grist. This grist is then added to a mash tun where it is introduced to hot water. So some distilleries will add the water at the specific temperature they want. Others will gradually rise the temperature in the tank in order to release different enzymes for different flavors. So this process converts all of the starches into sugars, and this liquid is now called wort. So it's kind of a sugary water mixture. Alright, so let's recap. The grain has been grown, harvested, malted in some cases, milled, put into the mash tun to convert the starches to sugars, and is now called wort. So then depending on the country you're in, it will vary a little bit from here. In most non-US distilleries, the wort is strained from the grist or the grains and ran through a heat exchanger to the fermentation tanks. In the United States, we take that wort, which includes the grains, through the heat exchanger and into the fermentation tank. So fermentation is the next step, and this is where the wort gets introduced to yeast, which converts all of those sugars to alcohol. In the US, we call this beer after the fermentation, and in Scotland, Ireland, and most other places, they call it the wash. So it doesn't really matter, it's the same thing. Call it whatever you want to. Usually after the fermentation, it's about 8 to 18% alcohol by volume. So then the next step in the grain's journey to become whiskey is the actual distillation process. So in the US, we're taking this beer and we're running it through a number of types of stills, column pot. It doesn't really matter. The process is the same. It separates the alcohol from the water by boiling it, where alcohol boils and water remains in the thing. The alcohol vapors rise up through the still, run through a condenser to cool them and put them back into liquid form. So we have now turned a grain into whiskey. It's not the whiskey that you're used to seeing, because right now it's clear and unaged. It's known as New Make, White Dog, The next step, in order to get all of the rich flavors and the caramels, the vanillas, and that color that you see that you're used to seeing in whiskey, it has to go through the aging and maturation process. Now, depending on the type of whiskey being made, country you're in, all of those things, this can vary. But it's put into oak containers, whether it's a new charred oak or a used barrel, for aging. Now, the aging process also varies by region, type of whiskey, country, so forth. Sometimes it's years, sometimes it's decades. Once the whiskey is matured, distiller will take a whole bunch of barrels, blend them together to create a batch that is then proofed and bottled. The bottling process is then, after bottling, it is then sent to a distributor, which then gets it to your local liquor store, your restaurants, your bars, for you to enjoy. So this is a high-level overview of the process in which a grain becomes whiskey. However, I mean, there's so many steps within each of those other steps that I shared that each builds on the other, and everyone aids in creating the flavor of your favorite whiskey. There's not one that can stand alone, and they all impact each other. So it's very much a art science, but it's one that's fascinating, and it's a fun journey to be on, and discovering and learning about this and tasting all the different whiskeys and how each of the steps change that flavor. So anyways, I wanted to provide you a little bit of an overview so you can, understand what goes into what you're sipping. So till next time, cheers.